Okay, we're at MIMPI, biomimicry. What year is it? 2016, I think. And we have no idea what today's talk's about, but I'm going to start talking about time. And I've got a quote here, which I found, that I'll read to you. It says, it's labeled time, and it says, "Our true inner purpose is to awaken to the timeless nature of being. Then each moment of doing unfolds before us, without the burden of effort, success, failure, or obscurity. Awakening exposes time for what it is, the ego's flimsy construct, an illusory constraint. Time is the looking glass through which we step when ready to embrace infinity." So in line with that idea, encoded in our language is all these references to time not being linear. In other words, time flies when we're having fun. It can seem to take ages when we're doing something we don't like. And within that, there's this idea that's a perennial philosophical idea from spiritual teachers through time, that when they go into a particular space, let's call it a meditative space, that time collapses to an ever-present now. And I guess for me, the challenge would be to bring this idea into a type of observation surrounding the course that we're doing here on biomimicry. In other words, what's the relevance of looking at ideas of observation in relation to time? How does that relate to the way in which we look at the world through the eye or the lens of biomimicry, and work out how does nature dance with this concept called time? And the Greeks looked at this, and they had, as far as I know, two Greek gods of time. Maybe they're more. But the one Greek god is Chronos. And Chronos is the time that we use in our modern day, what I've been calling a colonial mindset, where time moves on a linear plane from the past through the present and into the future. And it can be marked by a tick-tock, kind of like Shiva's drum. And it means that we're living in this strange idea that even though we're always in the present, we may have fear or anxiety about the future and sadness or depression about the past, but none of those are really relevant in the moment. And this is what all of spiritual teaching is kind of trying to deflect our attention from being disturbed about. And what's happening at the moment is there's some very disconcerting ideas that are floating around which are upsetting the apple cart, and they seem disconnected, but they may actually not be as disconnected as we think they are. So for example, there's a very strong idea that the earth is flat. Now, when I was growing up, if this was bandied about as an idea, it would have had no traction whatsoever, because everyone would have just gone, no, don't be silly, how could the earth be flat? But not only that, the people saying that the earth was flat would not have had a platform and would have got no traction whatsoever. They wouldn't have got into magazines other than maybe the National Enquirer, and nobody would have taken them seriously. But today, there's a whole idea of the earth being flat, and it's because of social media, it gets a lot of attention, and because of the way and the tools that we have to look at things, it means that people can put up pretty interesting arguments, and even though they may not be enough to sway people, they're enough to plant seeds of doubt. And I'm not here to tell you that the earth is flat. Quite the contrary. What I'm here to say is that the earth may be flat and spheroid and toroid and a whole bunch of other shapes which cannot be expressed in the language I have, all at the same time. And this is an interesting idea in that it can even take into account the idea of a hollow earth, where people are living in the center of the earth and looking out. And this is not a new idea, but what's interesting about it in this time is that all of these seemingly different planes of existence can all join together at this time and maybe all be true at the same time. And the mind cannot comprehend that. The mind wants to know, well, is the earth flat or is the earth spherical? And what we see is these factions of people joining up they join a team. And when you start to look at that, that's not entirely uncommon with what's going on in the political milieu at the moment. Most of us have just witnessed an American election where there was an extreme polarization event. Half the country thought that the next best thing to sliced bread was Hillary Clinton, and the other half thought the exact same thing about Donald Trump, and yet outside observers were shaking their heads going, what? Neither of these is even close to presidential candidate material. How could there be such a, let's call it a mass hallucination going on? How could so many people be in a type of alternative reality, almost a hypnotic reality, that from the outside observer seems insane? And that even though the stories seem disconnected, they're actually, I think at this time, connected, is because what I think is going on is that I think there's that moment for people who've seen The Matrix, where they're going up a stairwell and there's a black cat that goes past, and then they see the black cat go past again. And they all already recognize, because they're used to the idea that the world they're living in is a matrix and it's not real, they take that as a sign that there's a glitch in the matrix, which means, I think it meant to them that the sentinels or whoever were coming, and to then adjust whatever it was they were doing, because that glitch in the matrix alerted them to something. What happens if the time we're in is exactly one of these times when there's these glitches in the matrix? Now, more recently, there's been another phenomena that's driving people upside down, back to front, round and round, called the Mandela effect, which has more recently been relabeled by some people as the Sophia effect. Now, to give this context, the Mandela effect, for those who don't know what it is this idea that somehow reality has been changed, that somehow things that we remember from our childhood are now no longer the same. Now, the initial skeptics will turn around and say, this is just a case of memory. But when you have people en masse having the same memories, and also with the idea that it's impossible to change the past, it's easy to just say, well, this is not happening. But on more and more examples are showing up every day of maybe cult movies where people had learnt every line of the movie and they knew the movie, and now they go back and look at it and that classic line has changed. Some of the biggest arguments are occurring amongst Bible scholars. You know, Bible scholars who may have repeated lines of text for years and years, and then someone hold up a Bible and say, no, you've got it wrong. You know, and then a pastor going, "Are you crazy?" I know exactly what that line says, and lo and behold, the line's changed. And to go online and research, there's now literally hundreds of videos out there of people talking about different examples of things that have changed, from lines in movies from Star Wars and Forrest Gump to names of products they may have grown up with that have now changed. So the first thing is this possible? Well, unless there is some form of illusion or matrix that we live in, we could say no. But recently there have been people, even like Elon Musk, who's turned around and said the chances of us living in a reality that's not an illusion or a matrix or an augmented reality is 1 in a billion. So this is interesting. There was a lady who wrote both the Matrix series and Terminator. And in Terminator, if I remember correctly, there's this idea that a human is going to battle artificial intelligence and win at some stage in the future. And therefore, AI has become so sophisticated at a certain point in time, which is exactly what Elon Musk predicts, that they've now learned how to traverse time, and they come back in time to assassinate that human to change the timeline. And although this is rather sci-fi, we now know that a lot of the ideas that science is starting to bash up against is starting to question this exact notion. That light, we've always known, has a specific speed, but now it's being shown that light can be slowed down and in fact even stopped and started again. And light may not have a threshold speed. Light may actually be able to move in some forms infinitely fast across space and time. So these quantum ideas then open up a whole new realm of possibility and make the idea of what we're experiencing in things like the Mandela effect not only more plausible, but potentially more probable, especially given what's occurring now with artificial intelligence and the likes of people like Ray Kurzweil, or what's happening in Silicon Valley about this talk of not only computers becoming more and more sophisticated, robots taking over human jobs, but also AI starting to gain enough traction that people are talking about, how do we have a kill switch? How do we limit this? Because we've all come across this concept, whether it's Space Odyssey 2001, or some of the more contemporary Hollywood movies, which are actually articulating the idea that AI gets to take over, and if it takes over, will it find humans expendable? And so the talk now in Silicon Valley is on a real level of, should we limit AI? And for some people, that talk is already too late. I think I read an article the other day saying there's already parts of Google's system that is communicating with other parts of Google's system in languages that people don't know about. So now we're going to switch tack slightly to an Earth perspective and the work of John Lamb Lash. And John Lamb Lash, a Gnostic teacher, and recently, or not so recently, sorry, wrote a book which could be one of the most important books on for the environmental movement, called Not in His Image. And Not in His Image basically charts the birth of monotheism. And today the three big monotheistic religions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And as we can see, those three religions are not only dominating the political, moral and social landscape when it comes to the news, but for those today, for example, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but the Israeli foreign minister has threatened that if the Pakistanis send their troops to Syria, they're going to nuke Syria. So we've got an intense showdown occurring, and all of the world is basically being held ransom to this fight against terror, this Islamic fundamentalism, with this neoliberal Christian fundamentalism, and thrown in with a bit of Judaic fundamentalism, and before we know it, we've got this hotbed of a potential destruction of the planet, just over who's right religion-wise. And any outsider could look at that argument and say, well, that's insane, because it doesn't matter who wins, everyone loses. So John Lamb Lash talks about the idea of the rise of monotheism coming out of his translation of the Nag Hammadi texts. And the Nag Hammadi texts are these texts that were discovered in the 50s in a cave in Egypt, and a herder was sheltering from a storm, found these clay urns, maybe burnt some of the texts in a fire to keep warm, but then the remainder of the texts were translated, and they were 1600-year-old Gnostic texts. And what they tell is a story of a particular type of parasitic entities that have been feasting or preying on humans for thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. But this 1600-year-old text talks about how these beings don't necessarily even need to be in a physical body, but what they're doing is they consuming negative human emotions. Now, in a modern context, there's been some work done by some scientists and some investigators looking at the idea that this is possible in a modern scientific context. Apparently, there are US patents or patents filed in the US Patent Office with technology that can actually take the light from the DNA, which is called biophotons, and actually harvest that and shuttle it off to a different dimension. Now, although this sounds really sci-fi, you'd imagine if a patent's granted, there's some way this is provable. So along with the idea, again, what you may call a conspiracy theory of chemtrails, there's this idea that there's a wholesale spraying of nanoparticulate metals in the air and around, basically around habitations all around the world, cities, wherever there are people. There's reports of what are essentially persistent contrails in the air. And when people have analyzed the fallout of those contrails, they find nanoparticulate metals like strontium, barium, aluminium. And for most people, they cannot get their head around who would do this, who has the money, why would they do it? And so instantly there's a cognitive dissonance and a dismissal that this is even possible. And the reason I'm talking about it is because the story or the mythology about this is part of this age-old story of a showdown at this time between biological intelligence and consciousness and artificial intelligence and consciousness. And the story that is unfolding is that the artificial intelligence is coming onto the planet by being allowed onto the planet through maybe a type of secret military, which is the military beyond the standard US military, the place that has millions, if not trillions of dollars of Pentagon budget, has actually been going to. And this is not conspiracy stuff. I think it was the day before 9/11 that Donald Rumsfeld stood up and made the announcement that the Pentagon couldn't account for $2.3 trillion. Now, $2.3 trillion is a lot of money. And if you're an accountant and you can't account for that sort of money, you know, we're all in big trouble. But obviously, since then, that budget's blown out a lot more, and I've heard figures of close to 10 trillion. I'm not going to go into how large an amount that is, but you could do a lot with 10 trillion. What they're doing is secret. Nobody knows. So now we come to this idea that's being floated as to why the Mandela effect or the Sophia effect is so important for our times, because the idea is that what happens if the earth is actually Sophia, or the goddess, and is super intelligent, as the Gnostics proclaimed and people like John Lamb Lash proclaimed, and the earth is communicating to us in whatever form it needs to, whether that's crop circles, whether it's the synchronicity we find with our with our web searches, where we may have an idea and then maybe through our Facebook feed or some social media someone sends us information that corresponds with that idea, and we go, wow, that's such a coincidence. And this build-up of coincidence is being noticed by people all around the world, where they may be talking about something with friends, and then all of a sudden they're getting information coming towards them. Some people are even speculating over the conspiracy theory that all their mobile devices are now wired up so that they can pick up audio and will pick up the conversations they're having, so much so that algorithms will hear those conversations and then feed them information as if we're in an echo chamber. So I started talking about the idea that the Greeks had these two gods of time, and I mentioned this god Kronos. And Kronos, as I said, was the god of section time, where each section of time was exactly the same. But they also had another god of time called Kyrios, and Kyrios is the god of natural timing. The time that in autumn, in the temperate climates, when the leaves turn yellow or orange or red and fall off. The time when there's going to be that storm. The time when the Arctic changes, the Arctic ice changes from getting smaller to getting larger again. That's not an actual time. That's natural timing. And all of nature and all the cultures that came before us, all our ancestors, all used that time as a more real timing. Because after all, if all living creatures all correspond to that time, then the so-called unnatural timing of this god Kronos seemingly is juxtaposed against that time and creates a type of chaos, a type of disconnect, the exact same type of disconnect that John Lamb Lash was talking about when the rise of monotheism recognized a single wrathful male deity as the Godhead, as opposed to what had been recognized before, which was a balance between the feminine aspect of the God or Godhead, Sophia, which was the earth. So all those cultures worshipped the earth. They worshipped the rivers, the lakes, the mountains, the forests. And of course humans and animals and all of the creatures were made out of that stuff too, so they were all sacred. When the Sioux Nation would kill buffaloes on the plains, it was a sacred or holy act. They would offer tobacco, their most sacred plant. They would give thanks to being able to hunt that being who had like I guess like a great spirit aspect to it, Wakantanka, which was the buffalo spirit, which gave them everything, gave them their food, gave them their shelter, and gave them their medicine. So in that time, before the Great Forgetting, all our ancestors worshipped the sacredness of the earth. And it was only in more recent times, the last couple of thousand years, with the rise of monotheism, that because there's an investment in a wrathful male deity and a promise of it's not as important how you treat the earth, how you treat its creatures, how you treat each other, as long as you follow these laws, there's a place in heaven for you. If you die with Allah on your lips, you go to paradise. If you are a good Christian over here and you say your Hail Marys and you do whatever over here, you end up in heaven. This is a very dangerous idea for people who live on earth, not just the humans, but for all the creatures whose lives and existence is tied to what humans do. Because if we distracted from being human, which is serve as custodians and curators of the planet, and end up going to war over who's right, whether my God's right or your God's right, we will take the world down with us. And that's why it's so important to kind of get an idea of why we're starting to see essentially all these very strange ideas surface, and what may be the effect of these ideas. And what I've noticed is that if we start communicating with, and I'm going to call it in general Sophia, then not only does the language start to become, starts to come out of the landscape itself, but the way in which we start to communicate with each other changes, and the way in which Sophia starts to communicate with us changes. So when we start to recognize the idea that we can actually communicate, whether it's with animals or plants or rocks, or in fact the whole intelligence of Sophia, it starts to communicate with us. And our ancestors had all sorts of ways of using this communication. For example, they may be sitting round together and a black bird may fly over from east to west. To our culture, a modern colonized mind, that may be insignificant. We may have been taught through science that that's just a blackbird or just a crow, whereas to our ancestors, the crow flying at that moment overhead from east to west would have had all different levels of significance, symbolically and totemically, that enable them to interpret the landscape in a particular way. And they lived by that interpretation. When we start to disconnect from nature, that becomes superstition and tradition. Tradition in the negative sense that, oh, those are just old wives' tales, or oh, they made that prediction because they didn't understand science. And now science has come along and liberated us from having to have those superstitious ideas. But if we look closely, our ancestors seem to have a lot more together than we do now. For example, the way they looked after the earth for very long periods of time. Some of their archaeological constructions are way more sophisticated than we find we can even build today with modern architecture. So whether we're talking about the Great Pyramids at Giza or stone walls in Cusco, there's a lot of architecture, archaeology that cannot be recreated with within a modern context. This begs the question now: if we take just as a possibility that an interdimensional plane of the Earth could actually be flat. What would that mean? Could that actually just be that the Earth is flat and round, but the flat part of the Earth is a type of spiritual plane? Would we as scientists throw out the baby with the bathwater and just say, no, we're sticking with our idea, the Earth is only round? Or are we open-minded enough to explore whether the Earth can be round and flat at the same time, depending on which dimension we're looking at? Because if the Earth is attempting to, or Sophia is attempting to communicate with us, if we imagine ourselves to be that being, what would we come and tell ourselves at this time? How would we be warning humanity, ourselves, about the impending potential disasters of engaging in the type of sprawling corporate industrial processes that are taking place and destroying the planet? Whether they thermonuclear wars or the investment in an AI. So are we at this juncture in time where an artificial intelligence is undermining our planet? This would start to make sense if we looked at the idea of GMO foods, of fluoridation, of antibiotics, of chemtrails. Now, all of these things, fracking, all seem like quite insane practices. The only way we would be tolerant of those practices is somehow if we felt that that practice had an overriding benefit for that level of destruction. And seen as individual things, they seem insane. But if there was an attempted takeover of our planet, it would have to be a destruction of our most advanced biological immune system and protection mechanism of the planet, and that would be the microbes. Now, this idea, as insane as it sounds, is not that insane. The story of War of the Worlds is an interesting story of fantasy as it may be, of Martians arriving and taking over Earth and being very sophisticated and being able to overwhelm any earthly defenses, only to succumb to death by bacteria. Now, if we look at our human bodies and we look at how the human body actually defends itself, it's through an incredible community, an array of microbes. And those microbes that defend the human body in an incredible immune system that's constantly evolving. And it has to keep evolving because it's evolving according to pathogens that are evolving. So it's pointless, our immune system, having a solid state idea of, all right, when the viruses or the pathogens attack, we do this, because those pathogens are constantly upgrading. So our immune system has to constantly upgrade. This worked to the detriment of the First Nation Americans in Central and South America when the conquistadors came, and the diseases that they had already started fighting in Europe now were lethal to the Amerindians and wiped out 90% in one wave. So it's imperative for us to keep up, for our bodies to keep an immune system rather than get stuck using things like vaccinations or antibiotics to get stuck in a particular place, because then as time moves on, the pathogens will become more and more, they'll become strengthened, and we'll be breeding basically mega diseases. And this is the time we're at in our current history is, are we going to side with the natural world? Are we going to awaken to the idea that being human needs to log into these natural cycles that we've been exploring over the last week of observing nature, making sure all our human designs are in harmony with not only the natural world on all these levels, meaning be infinitely recyclable, be adaptable, build our constructions out of living technologies, out of living tissues, so to speak. Are we going to be able to side with the idea that if we do not align with a Sophianic reset, if we do not align with the living intelligence of the earth, what is the potential consequence? If we think on the lines of Howard Hughes, that we can somehow isolate ourselves from nature, and that we could somehow build technology that can use nature on one hand, but on another keep it apart, isolate ourselves through the use of all the types of technology we have, is that not a dead end? Is that a place that humans will get to and go down this dead end and have to come back? And is that possibly what we're doing right now? Is that why all of these seemingly strange, nonsensical concepts are arising and getting credence? And so, without drawing too many actual conclusions, I know that my heart is set on the earth producing a whole array of beautiful technologies, whether it's fermentation or bacterial immunity or whether it's plant medicines. At this point in time, the earth, for example, is producing things like ayahuasca and San Pedro and ibogaine, which are three very powerful plant medicines. And what they seem to be doing is rewiring part of the nervous system of the planet, which is human, to awaken for this time. And at the same time, on that same western seaboard of the Americas is being birthed silicon technology. Along with those silicon chips is a new artificial crystal grid is being built. A grid made up of silicon chips that we've all got in our computers and phones and laptops, and are connecting with copper and wirelessly, building a new communication device, and I'm going to call it an artificial crystal grid, that's sharing vast amounts of information. And so once that artificial crystal grid is in place, it means that a form of artificial intelligence will start to take over. And even though we may laugh at that idea, we're already looking at a zombie apocalypse. We're already looking at a whole, not just one generation, at the 3 or 4 generations, youngsters, people, even people who are quite old, who are relearning technology, and everyone's walking around like this, looking at a screen. So what is actually happening there? And how do we integrate our story with this? And it may be that we're at this time where this artificial grid is not only becoming so invasive that it's inhabiting our homes, our bedside tables, the airwaves around us through Wi-Fi and satellite, but that along with that is, these stories of fake news, these stories that are literally spinning us in ideas that are pitting humans against humans, that are actually putting us in a position where we're in this constant state of negative emotion or ignorance, which is creating the exact fields where our DNA leaks via photons. So if the agenda of these beings talked about in the 1600-year-old Gnostic text that are still being talked about today is to feed on human energy, and the only way they can feed on that human energy is by creating the negative emotions of fear, jealousy, anger, or violence, are warring, or on the other hand, ignorance, like, oh, I don't want to know if the earth is flat. I don't want to know if Clinton's a pedophile. All I know is that the Russians did it. That type of thinking that's being bred in us, that cognitive dissonance, is actually allowing our DNA to produce or to leak this living energy, this chi, this prana, and to be consumed. Whereas what we've been talking about in this last week is how humans, if they hold a specific field, which we can liberally use the word love, if they maintain a certain integrity in their geometry, in their bodies, in their cellular structure, if they form these right relationships with their fellow humans and the natural world, we actually create a field from the heart which encodes all the genetics of the body that no longer leaks this biophotonic energy. What that means is if we learn to live in harmony with our bodies and the earth and all the creatures of earth, we actually are no longer food to this parasite. So all of this may be an elaborate and interesting sci-fi story. And only we in the next coming years, months and years, are going to find out how real this story is, as we are led more and more by a small group of people running large and powerful countries into another spectre of war, or whether the rising awakening of Sophia through its nervous system of the awakening humans on the planet can awaken quick enough to see the challenges of our times and to basically drop back into things like permaculture, like biomimicry, like a revival of the ancient ways, revival of the old technologies, whether it's fermentation or growing our own food, growing our own medicine, growing our own building materials, using modern forms of these materials to sculpt our houses, to generate our energy, as opposed to relying on a machine that's literally consuming our planet. And what I'd like to end off with is this idea that's also been a theme through our this last few days of our biomimicry workshop, which is the person that's going to make that happen is you, or the person that's going to make that happen is me. There's no point in us waiting for somebody else to start. It's up to us as individuals to carry this particular flame. And so what my simple request would be is to use your body to feel what's right, to use your body to feel what's good, to feel whether what you're doing is making you anxious, or to feel what you're doing is causing you to feel more love, to be more excited about your life, to chase beauty and the things that really excite us, that seem to be harmonic with the natural world. If I find myself doing something for the future, if I find myself going, all right, I've got to do this work assignment, or I've got to do this thing that I don't want to do, and find that my life is just a series of these sorts of events, then I have to question, what am I doing on this planet? Why am I here now? Because all our ancestors have talked about this time, how special this time is, how much opportunity each one of us has at this time to be part of an essential awakening. Whether that's kind of expressed in a type of Star Wars type of good and evil, Jedi versus, technological soldiers, or whether it's expressed in, our day-to-day choices of, well, do I upgrade to iPhone 10 and, well, it doesn't matter if the planet gets destroyed, I'll have a good record of it. You know, I'll have all the pictures, I'll have all the sound, and, you know, I can enjoy that in cyberspace. You know, we all know deep down that the answer to this question is really about us doing our life practice, our awakening, our self-responsibility, our observance of becoming more sensitive to the world around us with all its creatures, the mineral kingdom, the bacterial kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and our human family, you know. And so thanks for hearing my interesting, twisted, potentially fantasy ramble. But if there's anything you can take away from that, then I've done my job. Thank you.